Hey, Larken Rose here, and let me get right to the point. We are now accepting applications or auditions or whatever you want to call them from people who want to be in the Jones Plantation movie, the real live full-length feature film that we're making out of the Jones Plantation, the little animated thing that I did years ago. I will put a link below to the animated version for those of you who have no idea what the story is. Of course, the movie is way more in-depth. Has way more characters, is way more, it's all the way a movie instead of just a little animated thing. But you get the general plot from the animated thing. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to read a basic description of everyone in the cast, starting with the most prominent characters who have the most presence and the most lines, down to extras and people who aren't involved very much. And if any of these, if you think you could do a convincing job, email me at larken@larkenrose.com and tell me which characters you want, and I will send you what's called a side. I only learned that term yesterday, which shows how much I know what I'm doing, which is a little chunk of the script for you to learn and practice, and you can then make a video audition to send us that I will forward on to the director, and we can go through them and start to whittle it down. I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of responses to a bunch of, the different characters, so don't get your hopes up too much. Also, we absolutely would love to have a bunch of voluntarists in on this. We will not let the quality of the movie suffer for that. So we're not going to have a bunch of people who don't really know what they're doing and do a bad job just because they're our buddies. But there are enough voluntarists these days that I think we can actually get a bunch of people who do a really good job who also happen to be voluntarists. It's not at all a requirement. Like you can send it in whoever you are. But we're sort of hoping for that as much as possible. So I'm going to run down a list of characters. Again, if any of these strike you as somebody that you think you could pull off and be convincing as an actor, then send me an email and I'll send you back a little chunk of the script to record a video audition and try out. The most important character in the movie is Mr. Smith, even though he's the villain, not the good guy. In the movie, he is a black man. At least in his 40s. He's a former slave, probably in his 50s. I'm not sure there even is an upper limit to what age he can be. I mean, not 100 or anything. But he is basically a brilliant sociopath, and he's my favorite character, even though he's an evil bastard. He specializes in deception and mind control, and he uses his skills to help slave owners completely subjugate their slaves mentally and physically, using all manner of schemes and manipulations. So that's a really important character. Now, for some of these important roles, we have some well-known actors in mind that we'd like to see if we can get. No idea if we're going to get them, but we're not gonna tell everybody else you can't send in an audition. If you think you're up to the task, then let me know. I'll send you a piece of the script and you send in an audition. So number 2 is Mr. Jones, who's the plantation owner. White guy, not surprisingly, in his 50s or 60s. He's sort of a grouchy, old school plantation owner, cotton plantation, who manages his slaves the old-fashioned way, by brute force. And he's a little slow in understanding and adopting Mr. Smith's more creative methods for subjugating his human livestock. But he's an important character. Then Mr. Johnson, who's Jones's cousin, also white guy, probably 50s or 60s. And he is brought in like halfway through the movie to give the slaves the appearance of having a choice, because they get to vote between Jones being in charge or Johnson being in charge. And Johnson is a little more intelligent and less emotional and less of an alcoholic than Jones is, but sort of classic plantation owner type. Samuel is basically the main hero, slave, somewhere around 20 probably, maybe early 20s. He realizes that something's wrong. He's a hard worker. He's a good kid. He yearns for freedom, not just for himself, but for his 2 younger sisters, who we'll get farther down the list. And they're part of his main motivation for trying to make things better or trying to get them out of there or something. He wants to free all the slaves, himself included, but he's one of the first ones to have enough of an awareness that he's suspicious of Smith's tricks and realizes this isn't freedom, and I'm not sure he's really here to help us. Then there's Jared. I'm not going to describe much about him because we already know who's going to play him. But he's a big, burly, nasty overseer who works for Mr. Jones, an overseer of the slaves. Then there's Mrs. Jones. I know who may very well end up being Mrs. Jones already, but I'll still throw it out there because you never know what's going to work and what won't work. She's wife of Mr. Jones, plantation owner. Grouchy, bitter, less than amused by most of what's going on most of the time, which is kind of justified because Jones doesn't treat her that well. Smith shows up and he doesn't treat her that well either. So not a huge part, but, has some lines and has a presence there. Then there's Noah, the closest thing that Samuel has to an ally. Another slave, 20s, maybe 30s. He also kind of has this idea of freedom. And he asks to be allowed to run in the election when they're supposed to choose between Jones and Johnson. And Noah says, well, can I run too? And I'm not going to tell you what happens. Then there's Isaac, a slave in his 40s. He's older, more sort of worn out, more obedient slave. He, keeps his head down, tries to avoid trouble, and he's mostly just annoyed by Samuel being uppity and causing trouble. Martha, a slave probably in her 30s. We may know who's going to play her. She's kind but well-trained, to put it mildly. She also acts as a sort of surrogate mother of Samuel's little sisters, who their mom is not in the picture. So then there's Thomas, who's a slave probably in his 30s, quiet, selfish, shifty, and he quickly gets recruited by Mr. Smith to act as a spy against his fellow slaves. So a little bit of a slimy character. Then there's Sarah, one of Samuel's little sisters. She's probably about 9, and both of his sisters managed to be basically pretty little rays of sunshine in this otherwise kind of bleak, depressing plantation. And again, Samuel's main motivation for trying to change things or escape or something. Charles is a slave, probably in his 20s, mostly compliant, but he gets caught stealing at one point and gets punished for it. Minor role, but gets whipped. James, similar thing, but that happens very on in the movie. And James, slave, probably in his 20s, but he mostly just gets whipped because the overseer is a vindictive bastard, more than anything else. Now, there are 2 slaves, Scout and Slug, who are young, strong slaves and who end up being chosen to be part of the management team under the overseer who are running things. So they sort of become enforcers against their fellow slaves. And so they end up, doing a bit of the power trip thing, as people do when you give them power over other people. Then there's Abraham. He's the neighboring plantation owner, white guy, 50s, 60s, maybe even 70s, probably 60s. It's a fairly brief appearance. In fact, he may not even be seen that much on screen, but he has a number of lines. He's basically a nasty, sadistic bastard who has a short appearance in one little scene. Then there's Master Morgan, who is a brilliant but bitter, ruthless genius bastard. He is the one who owned Mr. Smith before Mr. Smith was Mr. Smith. He only shows up in a flashback, but he's there. I'm not even sure Morgan has any lines, but he's there being a bitter bastard. Then there's also Master Morgan's rival and his rival's wife, who again have an appearance. I don't think they have any lines, but they show up in a kind of dramatic and violent flashback. I'm not going to tell you what happens. But those are two short things. Morgan's rival is white, probably in his 50s. His wife might be in her 40s, white again. Back to the slaves, there's Loki, minor part, but has a couple lines, probably in his 20s. Then there's TT, who's a retarded mute slave boy, probably teenage. We need to get someone who's, probably a real actor to do a convincing job of that. No lines, because he's a mute. That's the plus side, but you actually have to be able to act and be convincing. Minor part, but something very significant happens, so it matters. Then there's KK, a slave girl, minor part, daughter of Charles, the slave. Has like one line, but is significant to the story. There's Flower, which is Samuel's other sister, who's probably around 4. I think her lines consist of one word. Then there are 2 Irish indentured servants, probably their 20s, maybe 30s. I don't even think they have any lines, but they have a presence as the overseer's helpers at the beginning, his enforcers, his fellow whip-wielding bastards. Now, I think there's around 10 other slaves who are just going to be extras. That can be men and women and like the whole age range. So there aren't much limitations without lines, but there are a number of scenes where it shows the whole group, whether it's, working in the cotton fields or having a meeting and Mr. Smith is talking to the whole group and stuff like that. We're going to try to arrange it so the extras, we can film all those scenes quickly rather than having them have to stay around for weeks and get them out of the way. But we will need 10 or a dozen or whatever other extras to be slaves. Then there are 4 farmhand thugs. They appear in one scene late at night to beat the crap out of somebody walking down a dark road. We already have several volunteers for that. They don't have lines, but their job is to sneak up on someone and beat the crap out of them for a few seconds. And the last 2 are 2, what I have down as blonde bombshells. The blondness may be optional, 20s classic Southern belle, but proper and refined. They show up very early in the movie, accompanying Mr. Smith in his fancy schmancy carriage as he arrives at the plantation to demonstrate his wealth and to shock and offend a bunch of people on the plantation. It's like, and there, obviously, you're probably shocked. Some of you are probably shocked to learn that, yes, in the movie version, Mr. Smith is black and a former slave. And the people in the movie are kind of shocked when he shows up, too. So that's the list of characters. Again, and I believe that's the entire cast. So it's fairly small cast. I mean, it is 40 people. So now, if you want to volunteer for like set stuff or whatever, you can send me an email, but that'll be a separate thing. I don't all the way know who the director already has in mind as far as, camera operators and stuff like that. That may already be covered. I don't even know. But if any of these characters sound like something that you think you could do convincingly, send me an email, larken@larkenrose.com. Tell me which character you're thinking of, and I will send you a little chunk of the script, and you can use that to make like a basic little video audition to send us, and I'll forward along that along to the director, and we'll check them out and start narrowing it down. I expect to get a whole bunch of submissions, so don't just assume you're going to get the part. But should be fun. And again, like I said, you don't have to be a voluntarist. You don't have to know or care about anything having to do with philosophy or politics or any of that. But it would kind of be cool if we got a bunch of qualified, talented people who also happen to be voluntarists, but whatever. The main thing is this movie has to be really dang good, and it's going to be. So if you want to be a part of it, then do what I just described and send me an email. Oh, by the way, our IndieGoGo campaign is still open, and people can still donate because, the more funding we get, the better we can make this thing. But that's still open, so I'll stick a link to that campaign down below. So go to it. That about sums it up. So let me fling this out there and brace for the avalanche of people emailing me, say, I want to be in it, I want to be in it. So ready, go.